To it. Good evening. I'm Emily Parsons, Deputy Director and Curator for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual lecture. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, presenting exhibitions and public programs, advocating preservation, and providing resources to classrooms. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done this work from its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark finished in 1905 as the winter residence for Lars and Isabel Anderson in Washington, D.C. And we do all look forward to getting back there in person as soon as we can. But I'm glad to be able to offer you these virtual lectures and authors' talks coming directly to your homes. Today's lecture is part of a series of events that we've organized to observe the 250th anniversary of events of the American Revolution, broadly speaking. Tonight, Dr. Marjoleine Kars will be speaking to us about the Regulator Rebellion in North Carolina, a farmers' reform movement that culminated in the Battle of Alamance, fought 250 years ago in May 1771. Years before shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, backcountry settlers in the North Carolina Piedmont launched their own defiant bid for economic independence and political liberty. The Regulator Rebellion of 1766 to 1771 arose from the conflict created by competing ideologies and goals when it came to religious outlooks, economic advancement, and political authority. The compelling story of the Regulator Rebellion reveals just how sharply elite and popular notions of independence differed on the eve of the revolution. Marjoleine Kars is a professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where she teaches early American history, Atlantic history, and women's history. A native of the Netherlands, she received her BA and PhD from Duke University. She is the author of 2 books. Her first, on the subject she'll be speaking about tonight, was titled Breaking Loose Together, The Regulator Rebellion in Pre-Revolutionary North Carolina, published in 2002. More recently, she has written Blood on the River, A Chronicle of Mutiny and Freedom on the Wild Coast, published just last year, about a massive slave rebellion in a Dutch colony that is present-day Guyana in South America. She is also a senior editor for International Labor and Working Class History and a regular book reviewer for the Washington Post.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily, and I'm very happy to be here with everybody in their homes, as you pointed out. I'm going to share my screen in just a moment. I'm very sorry that we can't all be together in DC, but maybe in not too long we'll be able to do that. Let me see whether I can get my screen shared correctly, and that should do it, I think. I presume if I don't hear anything from Emily, then I'm good. So good evening. I'm really delighted to talk about the North Carolina Regulation, which is a movement that's much less well known than I think it ought to be, despite Outlander season 5, which some of you may have seen. I have to admit I have not. And so I'm very happy to talk about my book, Breaking Loose Together. As Emily mentioned, the Regulator Rebellion in pre-revolutionary North Carolina. And I want to do sort of 3 things tonight. I want to talk a little bit about how someone with a Dutch accent came to write about the largest rural rebellion in early America. I want to give you an idea of what the North Carolina Regulation was all about. And I want to end by suggesting how the North Carolina Regulation fits into the American Revolution, which is, of course, an interest of everybody who attends events sponsored by the American Revolution Institute. So just to get all on the same page, as Emily mentioned, the regulation was a farmers' rebellion that started in 1766, ended in 1771, took place in the Piedmont of North Carolina, or the backcountry as it was called at the time, basically the area between present-day Raleigh and the mountains. The aim of the movement was to end government corruption and to create greater economic and political democracy. At the movement's height, some 5,000 to 6,000 men were members of it. which means that the great majority of free men in the Piedmont were a part of the regulation. The regulators engaged in a variety of activities, some of them legal, some of them extra legal, as we nicely put it. And I'm going to detail some of those for you in the talk. In the spring of 1771, North Carolina Governor William Tryon moved from the seat of government on the coast towards Hillsborough in the backcountry with a militia army to go and defeat the regulators, which he did at the Battle of Alamance in May of 1771. And the Battle of Alamance happened near what is now Burlington, North Carolina. And that ended the regulation. So how did I come to study this social movement? I started the project interested in two major 18th century events: the Great Awakening, that wave of religious revivals at mid-century that was of particular appeal to lower class Americans and which had been little studied for the Southern colonies. And I was super interested in the American Revolution, especially what historians call the revolution from below, the social conflict that accompanied the war for independence and which had been studied mostly in urban areas, including by a well-known historian, Gary Nash, who just died. But I was interested in the connection between the Great Awakening and the American Revolution in rural areas, not urban areas. And so the North Carolina backcountry proved the perfect field of study. Although the largest agrarian rebellion before independence had taken place there, North Carolina had been studied very little. And I decided that I wanted to write a social history that was focused on the experience of ordinary people in order to see how rural free people in the South fared in the years preceding the American Revolution. And I started out by studying court records, but for some reason they really didn't speak to me. And it was in the church records where I was hoping that I might find more evocative evidence about daily life, that the Piedmont really came alive for me in the Quaker records in Greensboro, North Carolina, and especially in the Moravian records in Winston-Salem. I began to hear the voices of ordinary people, not the voices of the learned ministers that historians had studied so ably until then, but really the church minutes and the conversations that were recorded in the journals of itinerant ministers revealed to me a world in which ordinary farming men and women were deeply influenced by revivalist Protestantism and were wrestling very actively with crucial moral and political questions in their own communities. And I decided that it really couldn't be an accident that the Regulator Rebellion took place in the midst of this subversive religious and vibrant religious climate. And so I decided that I would focus my work on the interplay of religion and rebellion in the backcountry. Now, historians who had written about the regulation before had usually explained it in three different ways. They had either seen it as the outcome of class conflict, or they attributed it to paranoia on the part of farming men and women in the Piedmont, or farmer frustration over thwarted economic aspirations. And none of these explanations seemed very satisfying to me. It seemed to me that to explain 5 years of costly struggle in terms of, by referring to paranoia or frustration didn't show a lot of respect for the farming men and women living at the time. And class conflict has never automatically led to armed rebellion or to rebellion. And so it seemed to me that I had to do three things. I had to understand better the political economy of the Piedmont, so I understood what people were up against. I had to figure out how rural men and women in North Carolina thought about the world and what their hopes were for the future. And I wanted to connect the rebellion to the American Revolution. And so I want to briefly review those three things with you: political economy, ideology, and the revolutionary context. So this is a picture of a revival meeting in the colonial period that I should have switched to earlier. The North Carolina Piedmont was first settled in the 1740s and 1750s as part of a massive internal migration down the Great Wagon Road. You see it on this line here. When folks from New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia began to move into the southern backcountry, first into North Carolina, of course. And the population of newcomers grew very rapidly from a couple of hundreds in the 1740s to almost 40,000 on the eve of the regulation in 1766. So they came down the wagon road looking for family independence, or what they called competency, which meant that they wanted to create a community of independent land-owning families who worked their farms with family labor and a hired hand or two, and perhaps one or two enslaved people, who would have access to sufficient economic resources not to be dependent on anyone, and who would have the freedom to practice their religious beliefs without interference. And people had this notion that the backcountry would offer this to them. But such dreams of family independence were threatened by ambitious men who moved into the Piedmont with different plans. To such men, the newly opened backcountry was kind of a developing economy, and it provided great opportunities to get rich quickly and to buy slaves in large numbers so that they could safeguard themselves and their own families from ever having to do any manual labor again. And these conflicting ideals between the creation of a society of independent, land-owning families using mostly free labor, and a hierarchical society with wealthy elites at the top who used enslaved labor, really lay at the heart of the regulation. And farmers quickly figured out that these backcountry elites were using their political offices to enrich themselves at the expense of the great majority of people. So let me explain that to you a little bit further by making reference to some typical regulator grievances. One of the major grievances the regulators had was about land. Backcountry settlers believed firmly that they should have cheap access to land. Because they felt that improving the land, and you see a picture of that here, as they called the process of turning forest into farms by cutting down trees, was really hard work. And they felt that land should be available cheaply to the folks who put in sweat equity, if you want to put it that way. Backcountry elites felt differently. They controlled access to land, either as agents for the crown or agents for absentee landowners or for agents for large speculators. And they also patented large acreage for themselves. And so when a farming family sat down on a piece of land and improved it, as you see in the image, these officials would come by and they would say, boy, that's a nice farm you created here. You realize, of course, that you're sitting down on my land, or you're sitting down on crown land, or so you either have to pay or you have to leave. And then farmers had to pay high prices for farms they had created themselves. And they had a choice of either paying these high prices if they could, or moving on further onto the frontier. And so regulators wanted to end fraud in the land office, and they demanded that unimproved land was taxed at higher rates to cut down on land speculation and people amassing large acreage without doing anything on it, just waiting for farmers to sit down on that land and improve it for them. Another major grievance of the regulators was that the local sheriffs and their allies embezzled people's tax monies. And indeed, Governor William Tryon, who was no friend of the regulators, estimated that 2/3 of all taxes in the Piedmont never made it into the provincial treasury. Some 67,000 British pounds were missing. And regulators were outraged. This was money that was hard for them to amass in the Piedmont because money was really scarce. There was not a lot of it circulating. So people had a hard time paying their taxes in the first place. Secondly, taxes were really high and they were very regressive. So ordinary people paid a bigger share proportionately than rich people did. And yet rich people, sheriffs and their cronies, were walking off with poor people's hard-earned tax monies. And so regulators wanted more government accountability. The third grievance of the regulators, actually I'm going back to this slide another moment, was the high cost of government. In the southern colonies, the local government was really the local courts. And the men who served as justices of the peace, as sheriffs, as clerks, as prosecutors, were invariably members of the local elite, who were chosen not for their understanding of the law or their high moral character, but they were chosen because they had the right connections or they had the money to buy their office. And such men doled out justice as they saw fit, and they benefited members of their own class, favoring creditors rather than debtors, for instance. And they also charged illegally high fees for their services. So a farmer coming to court for, say, a debt of £2 may, in the end, after many postponements and all kinds of machinations, owe an additional £5 in fees. And so regulators wanted to regulate their officials to make government less fraudulent. The fourth grievance of the regulators was the high price of credit. As you probably all know, farmers always need credit because they don't get regular paychecks. And because money was in short supply in the Piedmont, farmers needed credit even more. But there were no banks in colonial America. And so if people needed to borrow money, they had to borrow it from elite men in their own communities, which cost farmers dearly in terms of independence, as you may imagine. And so the regulators agitated for more fair debt laws, but they also agitated for the creation of a land bank where they might mortgage their lands from an independent agency and get credit that way rather than have to borrow from the local elites who then might force them to sell their crops to them or vote for them in the elections and so on and so forth. And so it's no wonder that expensive land, costly justice, high taxes, the embezzlement of tax monies, fee grabbing, and the collusion between creditors and public officials were all major regulator grievances, and that the aim of the regulators was to change this system towards a more level playing field and towards greater economic democracy, you might say, and farmer autonomy. Now, we all know, of course, that just because people want social justice doesn't mean that they will have the courage and the will to fight for it, especially in a day and age when trying to hold your government accountable could easily be construed as treason. And this is where religion comes in. I argue that Piedmont farmers found inspiration and justification for their political activism in Great Awakening Protestantism. So let me explain that to you briefly. So if I advance the slide. So most of the newcomers who came to the Piedmont were sectarians and dissenters from the Anglican Church. They were heirs to a long radical tradition that stretched back to the English Civil Wars and the Reformation, or the Reformation and the English Civil Wars, I should say, that had been rekindled. Those debates from that time had been rekindled in the Great Awakening that had swept the colonies at mid-century. So these sectarians and dissenters, we need to think of people like Quakers, Baptists, German Pietists, Moravians, New Light Presbyterians, as they were called, as well as many people who never joined the formal church, but who were nevertheless deeply spiritual. And such people emphasized what they called the spirit within, the godlike spark that lived within each person who had experienced a conversion experience, who had been reborn, and that provided divine guidance. So this belief in the spirit within proved enormously powerful because it celebrated the conscience of ordinary people. It assured them that moral truth lay within them, that it was in their grasp, and that they were capable of moral judgment. And this is particularly important in the 18th century because political theory held that only elites had this kind of moral judgment and that ordinary people lacked the judgment to be involved in politics. And therefore they were unfit to make political decisions, they were unfit to hold office. And in such a culture, the claim that rebirth, conversion, provided ordinary farmers with direct access to moral truth was enormously important because it gave farmers both the individual and the collective self-confidence to question the authorities and to shed their customary deference towards their social betters. Furthermore, backcountry Protestantism provided farmers with a very powerful religious critique of elite pride, greed, ostentations, displays of wealth, and elites' blatant disregard for the larger community. And so religious beliefs did not automatically translate, of course, into political activism. I'm not being that reductionist, but I'm arguing that backcountry Protestantism provided a climate that was conducive to the organization of a political mass movement. While some Piedmont farmers definitely thought that their religious convictions meant that they should turn away from the world because the world was wicked, many others, a majority, I think, like Regulator spokesman Herman Husband, argued that God-fearing people had a religious duty to stand up to an unjust government, and that allowing your government to take immoral action was in fact to engage in sin yourself. Now, you will probably recognize, as aficionados of the American Revolution, that such arguments were related to the arguments that were used by the Sons of Liberty, the developing independence movement to justify resistance against Britain. When the Regulators got started in 1766, they drew inspiration from the Stamp Act protests. These protesters, who called themselves Sons of Liberty, justified their resistance to Britain with a widely accepted political theory that held that if a government betrayed the trust of its people, people had a duty to correct the situation through legal means, initially petitions, elections, for instance. But if people repeatedly banged their head against the wall and such peaceful means were not working, then forceful popular resistance was not only allowed, but it was in fact a duty in order to preserve the common good. Now, the Sons of Liberty were the leading men in each colony, and many of them firmly believed that this political theory of forceful political or forceful popular resistance was only applicable to movements that were led by them. It only, such theory only held for movements where they were in charge. Their presence, they believed, would ensure that people were protesting for the common good. And in their eyes, lower class protesters tended to only be interested in their own private interests. And so leading citizens did not like to see ordinary people take charge of the political process. And in fact, one of the challenges of the revolutionary leaders would be to rouse the popular classes sufficiently to put bite into their resistance against Britain, but rouse them not so much that they might want to start talking about justice and liberty at home. So the regulators, who used the political theories of the developing independence movement, gave such ideas greater political heft by combining them with strong religious principles. And so they are, I think, an early example of how in the revolutionary era, lower class people appropriated the rhetoric of the elite-led independence movement to fight for local economic democracy. Now, believing that you have a duty to reform government, even a religious duty, as the regulators did, doesn't mean that you're going to take rash action. In fact, you can see throughout the regulation that farmers, like social activists everywhere, tried at all times to use the least amount of political force or protest that would get them what they were after. So let's take a look at what the regulators actually did. They started by trying to meet with local officials. And this is an image of Edmund Fanning, who was one of the most hated officials in the backcountry. He lived in Hillsborough, and they wanted to meet with him to talk things over, and he refused. When that had no result, trying to meet with officials, they started to petition the governor, here in a picture that comes from the TV or the internet series, TV series Outlander, with his wife, Margaret Tryon. They tried to make their grievances known to Governor Tryon by means of petitions, but Governor Tryon was not very interested. And in fact, he sided with local officials like Edmund Fanning, who was in fact one of his close friends. The regulators also petitioned the Assembly, hoping that these men would take active legislative action on their behalf, but that also didn't work. Then they entered local elections to get pro-regulators elected to the Assembly, which is actually a big deal because ordinary farmers did not belong in the Assembly, and they were surprisingly successful. But in the Assembly itself, they were outnumbered, and so they weren't able to get much done. And it's really only when people repeatedly try such legal measures and get no results, time after time, that they get exasperated and they begin to engage in extra legal action. They refuse to pay their taxes until they could be assured that the money would actually end up in the provincial treasury. And they actually collected the money themselves. So it's not like they didn't want to pay and spend the money on other things. They collected it themselves, but they refused to turn it over to the sheriffs until they could be assured that it would end up where it was supposed to be. They attacked sheriffs to repossess property that sheriffs had seized to satisfy debts or taxes. They disrupted court proceedings to prevent farmers from losing debt cases. And they set up so-called people's courts, where they began to speak justice themselves. In September of 1770, a large group of regulators disrupts the superior court, which was sitting in Hillsborough, which is one of the bigger towns, small town, but one of the bigger towns in the Piedmonts. You see a map of it here. And they beat up a number of lawyers and merchants and officials, and they destroyed the house of Edmund Fanning, that hated official whose picture I just showed you. And the authorities retaliated forcefully. They accused Herman Husband, the leader of the Regulators, or spokesman for the Regulators, and who had been elected to the assembly in 1769. They accused him of libel, and they expelled him from the assembly, and in fact, they put him in prison. And next, they passed a sweeping riot act that gave Governor Tryon the authority and the financial means he needed to get the militia together and march the militia from the eastern counties all the way to the Piedmont to go and subdue these dangerous regulators. And in fact, on May 16 of 1771, about 1,100 militiamen confront about 2,000 farmers on a field near Alamance Creek. Again, a picture from Outlander. And 2 hours after the first shot was fired, 17 to 20 farmers had died, some 9 militiamen and 150 men on both sides had been wounded. 1 regulator was hanged on the spot without the benefit of trial. And the governor then proceeded on a punitive march through the backcountry with his army, destroying settlement, requisitioning food for his army and his horses from people. And he forced some 6,000 regulators or regulator sympathizers to take the oath of loyalty to the British king, even though the regulators had never renounced their loyalty to the king. In June, 12 regulators, this is another later picture of the Battle of Alamance. In June, 12 regulators are tried during hastily put together trial proceedings, and 6 of them are hanged. Some of the most well-known regulator leaders fled the province, including Herman Husband. And as a result of all this violence and repression, the regulator movement as an organized movement was really crushed in the summer of 1771, although many individuals remained defiant and continued to support their leaders. Hundreds of families, in fact, left the Piedmont, moving further west, looking again for that elusive autonomy and ideal of family independence on new frontiers. William Tryon, Governor Tryon, left New York the day after the hangings to become the governor of New York, where he would fight a new set of agrarian rebels, the Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys. And the new governor of North Carolina, Josiah Martin, quickly, in fact, came to sympathize with the regulators. And he did his best to appease some of the farmers' immediate grievances. And the assembly, under his leadership, decided that it was best to issue a general pardon to all folks who had been involved in the regulation, excepting only Herman Husband. And the king agreed to this. So despite such efforts at reconciliation, the regulation had major repercussions for the American Revolution in North Carolina. Many of the elite men who had fought as officers in Tryon's army were the very same men who led North Carolina in the Revolution. And this created, as you may imagine, considerable resentment and anti-revolutionary feeling in the Piedmont. In the eyes of many Piedmont farmers, they had already fought for their independence and they had lost. So why should they get burned again, particularly under the command of their former enemies? Many radical preachers in the Piedmont, in fact, advocated pacifism or even outright resistance to the revolutionary cause. And so whether North Carolina farmers decided to throw their lot in with the Tories or the Whigs, or they tried to stay out of the conflict altogether, none of them saw the democratic changes that they had fought for in the regulation become reality. The War of Independence brought vicious civil war to the North Carolina and in fact the entire southern backcountry. But when it was over, much the same men and much the same political and economic system was in place. And at the end of the war, one man spoke for many Piedmont farmers, whether Tory or Whig, when he reflected, quote, "I have fought for my country and fought for my king, and I have been whipped both times." So I hope that by now the connections between the North Carolina regulation and the social ferment of the pre-revolutionary period are clear. First, the North Carolina regulation shows us that independence and democracy, what independence and democracy looked like to ordinary people. It meant affordable land, affordable credit, affordable justice, and a democratic government that supported such goals. Obviously, mere independence from Britain didn't even come close to covering any of that. Secondly, the North Carolina farmers were by no means the only farmers, the only rural folk to fight for justice. From the mid-18th century well into the early national period, farmers all over the frontier or the backcountry fought to lower the cost of land, fought for justice, and fought for a cheaper credit. Land struggles, for instance, took place in upstate New York, where tenants fought landlords for decades, beginning in the 1750s. In what is now Vermont, farmers united under the name Green Mountain Boys, and they fought New York land speculators from 1764 on. In Maine, settlers calling themselves Liberty Men fought so-called great proprietors from the 1760s until about 1820. In northeastern Pennsylvania, farmers calling themselves Wild Yankees opposed speculators beginning in the 1760s and lasting until 1808. In the 1780s, Ohio squatters evaded federal land laws and federal troops. And from 1795 to 1810, squatters in northwestern Pennsylvania waged gang warfare against land speculators' agents. Other farmers sought to protect their farms by fighting for a fair and cheap system of justice that would protect people's rights and their properties from the moneyed man who intended to live on the labor of others. From the 1760s and 1770s, farmers in New Jersey, calling themselves Liberty Boys, sought what they called thorough regulation of the law through petitioning, through court closings, and through the creation of people's courts. Between 1770 and 1775, rioters in eastern Vermont frequently closed courts. In 1782, Ely's Rebellion rallied farmers in western Massachusetts and northern Connecticut against their judges. In 1786 and 1787, the New England regulation, also known as Shays' Rebellion, shut down the courts and hindered tax collectors in portions of Massachusetts and Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. So in much of the backcountry, and especially in Pennsylvania, regulators, also known as whiskey rebels, fought for greater economic and political democracy. And in 1799, in conclusion, farmers in central Pennsylvania mounted Freeze's Rebellion against a new federal land tax. In all of these movements, farmers sought to regulate their economy and their governments to make both more democratic. Wild Yankees, anti-renters, whiskey rebels, liberty men, and regulators fought for an American revolution that would guarantee wide land distribution and create governments that would protect farmers from losing their farms. They fought for a political democracy in which they could safeguard their families' independence and in which political power would be centralized so their voices could be, or decentralized so their voices could be more easily heard. As in the case of the North Carolina Regulation, such hopes did not come to fruition, but the hopes for rural social justice continued to smolder, and we see it come back, for instance, after the Civil War, in agrarian movements, rekindling unexpectedly whenever economic pressures and moral principles combined to prompt farmers to organize politically and confront those who tried to keep them in debt. So the North Carolina Regulation was really one of the most powerful of these movements, one of the most visible, and it was certainly the first. Thank you. I will stop sharing my screen, so that I can see the moderator and hear your questions. I think we're back.
Thank you, Marjoleine. That was fascinating, especially the connections, of course, to the Revolutionary War just several years later. We do have some questions that are now kind of coming in fast and furious for you. So we'll get those started, I think, with a perhaps simple one, but coming from Samantha. Where does the name regulator come from? What does that actually refer to?
Well, as best as I could figure it out, Samantha, it was a term that was used in 17th century Britain, or England, as it was then still called, for people who were appointed to ferret out government corruption. And I think that regulators adopted that term to give themselves a sense of legitimacy, because those regulators in the 17th century were government appointed. And of course, the North Carolina regulators were not. But by calling themselves regulators, they may have been trying to take on a certain amount of authority that might rally people to their cause.
Okay. A question from Evan, and this may be painting with a broad brush or asking you to do so, but just looking ahead, 4 years to the Revolutionary War, when you look at the regulators themselves, were they more likely to stay out of the conflict entirely, to fight for the crown, or to become kind of American patriots fighting for independence from Great Britain? Can you make any kind of generalizations there about their experience in the regulation?
Yeah, great question. I don't think that anybody has done the legwork to somehow match all the signatures we have from regulator petitions to, for instance, revolutionary pension claims or army roles. The general idea is that definitely some folks joined the revolution, absolutely, and that others did not, that sometimes it was related to the particular configuration in their own immediate locale, where if some of the people they respected became revolutionaries, then they might have been more likely. If those folks stayed on the Tory side or were on the Tory side, they might have done so too. And in fact, we know that that revolutionary leaders complained about what was going on in the backcountry, that there were large numbers of people who either did not want to fight at all or who were in fact Tories, but we don't have precise numbers. It may well have mimicked the numbers in the revolution at large, which was about a fifth Whig, a fifth Tory, and about 3/5 who were like, you know what, I'm not sure this is my fight, and I just want to make sure that I and my family stay safe. But it definitely created debates in the backcountry where it was clear both to people at the time and leaders at the time that regulator grievances and what had happened in 1771 played a role in how people thought about the revolution itself.
Good. A question from George. Can you tell us more about the church records you consulted and where you found them?
Yes. The church records I found were the Quakers kept very good records, the Society of Friends, and so those are all housed at Guilford College. And some are housed in Pennsylvania. And those consist of meeting minutes, the minutes of the men's meetings and the women's meetings, because business meetings were sex segregated. And they show the various conflicts that people had in their Quaker meetings over all kinds of issues, from getting teenagers having sex before marriage, to people marrying out of the faith, to people being involved in political activism. I looked at the records of the separate Baptists, which are held, I think if I remember correctly, in the state archives. Similar thing, meeting minutes where people talk about their conflicts with each other and how to resolve them. And then the Moravian records, which are partly published, and the rest are held in Winston-Salem, in Old Salem. The ones that are published, of course, have been translated into proper or plain English, but a lot of the records by the Moravians were in German, and 18th century German is very hard to read. And those were really great because Moravian ministers minister to the people in their general area, not initially, but as soon as they realized that people really hungered to hear the word of God, they began to travel around. They became itinerant ministers, and they would comment on political activism. The Moravians tried to stay out of it because they were very law-abiding in order not to get in trouble as a group. But they would talk about, normally there would be a big meeting here, but today all the men have gone to a regulator meeting, so I just talked to a couple of people, or things like that. And they also would talk about meetings that they had with individual folks who would say, tell me more about you regulators or Moravians, and then they would debate all these theological issues with them, and at the end would say, this was really interesting, but I really want to be independent. I don't want to adhere to a church. So I got all kinds of interesting stories out of those. And you can find in the footnotes of the book exactly where I got each of those records.
Very good. So a question from Terry. How did news of the regulations spread in America during the revolt, and how was it viewed in other colonies?
Great question. It spread rapidly by word of mouth, of course, but also through newspapers. And it was initially particularly pro-independence newspapers and pro-independence leaders leading Sons of Liberty were very sympathetic outside of North Carolina to the regulation. And in fact, we have some nice records of leading Sons of Liberty coming to North Carolina, meeting with Eastern leaders, talking about the regulation and saying, isn't it great? The population is all stirred up, and the Eastern leaders going, no, you don't quite understand what this is all about. Let me tell you. And in the book I talk about, and I forget his name now, but one of these major leaders writing in his journal, I had some really illuminating conversations here with leading Sons of Liberty, and they set me straight about the regulators. I now understand that it's kind of a dangerous movement, and it's not really about independence from Britain, and we may have to change our ideas. And so the Sons of Liberty in Eastern North Carolina really worked hard to change perceptions among Sons of Liberty in other colonies to make them understand that this was not the kind of movement they wanted to be championing.
Very good. From Mary, how was the regulation remembered in later generations in America, particularly in the 19th or 20th centuries?
That's a wonderful question, and one that I can't answer quite as fully as I would like, because I didn't study that a great deal. But I do know that for a long time after the defeat of the Regulators, as many defeated people didn't want to talk about it. They were ashamed, they felt defeated, deflated, and it's really only, I think, for some people, of course, it lived on in family tradition. But I've gotten a lot of email from people who have read the book and said, now I understand my own family history better. And in fact, I've done genealogical research, and I now know that one of my ancestors was in the regulation, and I'm now proud of it, and I want to know more about it. And in fact, President Carter had an ancestor who was part of the regulation, and he wrote a novel about it called Hornet's Nest, which is not that great. But I think he used my book some to talk about it. So I think now people are beginning to be much more proud of it and interested in it, and talk about it more. And now we need this, I think, this consciousness to grow outside of North Carolina and really see this as a social movement that was important in the colonial period, and that we all ought to know much more about, not merely descendants.
Your book does fill a hole in that regard in modern scholarship. Switching gears a little bit, you have mentioned Outlander a couple times, so perhaps it was inevitable. We do have a question from Llewellyn. Outlander emphasizes the importance of Scottish clan loyalties in building the Regulator movement among the lower classes. Is that true?
I have not seen Outlander. I must admit I'm not much of a TV watcher, although I'm beginning to think I really ought to go watch it. And they did, at some point, the makers of the series interviewed me about the regulation. I think that they make a lot. I think they probably make more of that than is warranted, because yes, there were many Presbyterians in the backcountry. There were many people of Scottish descent, but there were also many English folks. There were Germans, there were Swiss, there were all kinds of different people in the regulation. And I think for some folks, clan membership may have helped. And there is certainly some evidence that old Presbyterian grievances from the previous century still played a role. But I didn't see a ton of evidence that it was a major consolidating force. And I think that really radical religion, more broadly seen, played that role more. Rather than ethnic affiliation. Yeah.
Good to know, good to know. We have a just short and sweet question from Christian. Were Methodists involved in the regulation? Were they one of the?
Methodists actually come into being a little later. They grow out of the Great Awakening, but they really become important during the Revolution and after. So there are not really Methodists per se yet, although eventually followers of Whitefield will become Methodists or call themselves Methodists, but that doesn't happen till a little bit later. So I think people with Methodist sympathies, if you think about Methodism as a particular way of looking at how to organize the church, some of those sympathies were certainly present among Regulators, but Methodists per se did not yet participate. Otherwise, I would have definitely looked at their records, because they were good record keepers.
A question from Michael. Did the Royal Proclamation of 1763 banning all settlement west of the Eastern Continental Divide in the Appalachian Mountains have any role in the regulation or those farmers' communities?
I think it did not yet, because the proclamation was well to the west of how far settlers had moved in North Carolina. And so I think that it was more some of the leaders of the revolutionary movement who were interested in getting rid of the Proclamation of 1763 because they already had acreage beyond the Proclamation line, and they would not be able to legally charge people for who moved onto those lands unless that Proclamation line was rescinded. So if anything, ordinary farmers, had they gotten that far, might in fact have thought the Proclamation line was just fine, because it would have kept big speculators like people like George Washington from forcing people to pay for their own farms. But it's not an issue in the regulation because people have not yet moved that far.
Good. So from Timothy, he said you had mentioned the importance of the Quaker records that you consulted. He has a Quaker ancestor who was an active regulator, including at the Battle of Alamance. To what extent did Quaker regulators participate in more violent rebellions?
Well, that's of course a great question, because Quakers were pacifists, and this is apparently one of the reasons that Herman Husband, who was a disowned Quaker, but had been a Quaker, active Quaker, and then retained Quaker sympathies all his life, he was a pacifist, and so he did not want to be part of the Battle of Alamance. People later accused him of cowardice, but I think it was his pacifist convictions. And so it's likely that quite a few Quakers would not have wanted to participate in armed battle, but in fact, much of the evidence suggests that most of the regulators didn't expect it would come to a battle. They went to the battle armed with, most of them with farm implements, some of them with guns, but even the ones with guns only had apparently brought no more bullets than they would if they'd gone on a hunting expedition. People did not expect, they figured that it was going to be a standoff and that the governor, of course, would come to his senses and say, let's talk about it, let's work this out. Tradition has it that the governor gave the farmers an hour to disperse, and that even before the hour was up, he gave the command to fire. So there would have been significant numbers of sympathizers who would have been at the Battle of Alamance, but not to fight, but more to be there, hoping that their imposing presence would make Tryon reconsider, and of course not fire on his own people, but he did.
Mm-hmm. I think we're gonna wrap up with one or two final questions. We have had from several different people questions related to specific people who either they're descended from or otherwise have researched in the Piedmont, wondering if they were involved in the regulation. Does your book go into that level of specifics, or are there other sources they could consult?
It does. I worked really hard on the index. So every name that's mentioned in the book is mentioned in the index. So that is one good way for people to check on ancestors. And the published records of North Carolina also contain all the names that appeared on regulator petitions. So if folks look at my footnotes, they can go there. I'm also happy to answer some questions by email, but I can't, but I think the place to start is the book and its footnotes. Frankly, I think for many people that may be a first step.
Good. And to wrap things up, a question from Gloria: what happened to Herman Husband?
Well, Herman Husband is a fascinating figure. And he goes on to become a rebel rouser in Pennsylvania, where he is also elected to the assembly, but then he becomes a major spokesman for rebelling farmers there. And there's a book about him. I can't quite remember the title now, but if you do a search for Herman Husband, you will come across it. He's really a fascinating person.
So thank you again, Dr. Kars, for your fascinating remarks, and thank you all for attending. Good evening, and hopefully we'll see you again next time.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all. Bye-bye.